Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The 1st of September that year dawned with startling clarity. There was none of the customary London drizzle that usually blurred the city's edges, turning King's Cross Station into a watercolor smudge. No, the air was crisp and cool, as if someone high above had scrubbed the sky with a giant cloth, leaving behind nothing but impeccable azure. Cordelia Blackwood stood before the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, mentally counting. It was a habit of hers, counting whenever the world became too loud or chaotic. Inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 6. Her trolley was packed with geometric precision, a heavy leather trunk embossed with the family crest at the bottom, a smaller satchel containing the books she intended to read during the journey atop it, and crowning the pile, in an elegant circular cage, sat her little owl, Archimedes. Unlike his mistress, Archimedes made no attempt to maintain an air of aristocratic calm, letting out an occasional disgruntled hoot at the indignity of being carted about in a cage amidst such clamor. "Remember, Cordelia." Her father's voice was as level as ever, sounding as though he were delivering a lecture at the ministry rather than seeing his daughter off to school. "Emotions are merely reactions to stimuli. Reason is the instrument that allows one to classify those stimuli. Do not allow the former to cloud the latter." "Yes, father," she replied, straightening the collar of her navy blue coat. It was perfectly pressed. "And please, do try not to correct the professors in your very first week," her mother added, and the crinkles at the corners of her eyes deepened, softening her stern expression. "Even if they mistake the dates of the Goblin rebellions, it is impolite." "I shall try, mother. But truth is more important than politeness, is it not?" Her mother merely sighed, but there was more affection than reproach in the sound. They passed through the barrier, a sensation that always reminded Cordelia of plunging into cool water, a brief moment of disorientation before the world shifted. Platform 9 3/4 greeted them with thick white steam and a scent impossible to mistake for anything else, a blend of coal smoke, sweet pumpkin pasties, old carriage velvet, and pure concentrated magic. The scarlet steam engine of the Hogwarts Express stood billowing clouds like a great dragon, slumbering before a long flight. Chaos reigned all around, but to Cordelia it was a chaos that could be analyzed. She saw patterns. Here, a group of upper-year students greeting each other raucously after the summer. Probability of hugging, 90%. There, a terrified first year who had lost a toad, a classic variable that repeated annually. And there, parents, surreptitiously wiping away tears. After bidding her parents farewell, a restrained nod from her father, a swift but firm kiss on the forehead from her mother, Cordelia boarded the carriage. She found an empty compartment near the very tail of the train. She preferred the rear. There was less swaying on the bends, and, by her calculations, rowdy groups were statistically less likely to venture this far. She settled by the window, retrieved a copy of Theory of Magical Fields, 2023 edition, with annotated commentary, from her satchel, and prepared for the journey. But her solitude was short-lived. The compartment door slid open, and a girl with wildly tousled blonde hair, in which Cordelia would have sworn a real daisy was tangled, peered inside. "Is this seat free?" she asked, her robes thrown on haphazardly, clutching a sketchbook and a box of charcoal pencils that balanced precariously on the brink of falling. "Yes, certainly," Cordelia replied, automatically shifting her belongings to clear exactly half the space. Symmetry was essential. "I'm Elara," the girl said, flopping onto the seat opposite, sending up a small cloud of dust, either coal or magical, from her clothes. "Elara Vance. And you look as if you've already memorized all the textbooks." "Cordelia Blackwood." "And not all of them," Cordelia answered seriously. "Only the mandatory ones and half of the recommended reading," Elara laughed, and the sound was light and chiming like a silver bell. "I haven't even opened the book list. My dad says the best learning is practice. He does magic intuitively, just waves his wand and, wham, flowers bloom. I want to do that." The journey passed in a strange but pleasant contrast. Cordelia read, glancing occasionally out the window as green hills gave way to the harsher, darker landscapes of the north. Elara, meanwhile, drew. She drew everything, the view beyond the glass, Cordelia herself, endowing her sketch with a touch more mystery than reality possessed, and even the trolley witch when she trundled past. "You are drawing what isn't there," Cordelia remarked, examining one of the sketches. "There is no such tree in that landscape." "I'm drawing what it feels like," Elara replied, smudging a line on the paper with her thumb. "Isn't that more important?" The question hung in the air, and Cordelia, accustomed to operating with facts, found no rational answer. Perhaps that was the essence of Hogwarts, learning to answer questions that had no logical solution. When the train slowed and darkness fell beyond the windows, Cordelia felt a familiar flutter in her stomach. Not fear, no anticipation. She changed into her school robes, fastening every button with meticulous care. Stepping out onto Hogsmeade Station was like taking a gulp of ice-cold water. The night smelled of pine needles and damp earth. "Furs, years! Furs, years over here!" boomed a loud bass voice. It was Hagrid, the gamekeeper. He was as vast as a crag, yet the lantern in his hand swayed with surprising gentleness, illuminating the anxious faces of the children. The journey to the castle by boat was a tradition Cordelia had read about in Hogwarts, a history, but no description could have prepared her for the reality. As the flotilla of small boats glided out from under a curtain of ivy, and the great lake opened up before them, Cordelia's breath hitched. The water was black and smooth, like a mirror of obsidian, and in it was reflected him, the castle. It was not merely a building, it was a symphony of stone and light. Towers that seemed to scrape the stars, hundreds of windows glowing with warm gold, massive walls that remembered centuries. Cordelia tried to count the turrets to calm herself, but she lost count. This architecture did not submit to simple arithmetic, it was magical. "Look," whispered Elara, who shared her boat. She wasn't drawing. She was simply staring, mouth agape, the castle lights reflecting in her wide eyes. "It's alive." And Cordelia, contrary to her logic, thought, yes, it is alive. The sorting passed in a blur. The great hall was staggering. The ceiling, enchanted to mimic the night sky, looked so realistic that Cordelia had to remind herself it was an illusion, a projection of atmospheric phenomena. She automatically began to locate the constellations. Cassiopeia, Orion, Ursa Major, everything in its place. Astronomical precision. This calmed her. When Professor Longbottom, who was now deputy headmaster, called out, "Blackwood, Cordelia," she walked to the stool with a steady gait, back straight, chin up. She sat, and the old patched hat dropped over her eyes, cutting her off from the hall, filled with hundreds of staring faces. A quiet voice sounded in her head. It was dry, like the rustle of old paper. What an interesting mind, structured, orderly. You see the world as a vast library where every item has its place on a shelf. Much knowledge, oh yes. A desire to understand the very essence of things. Order is the foundation of understanding, Cordelia thought back. Is it? The hat's voice held a note of irony. But chaos is the beginning of creativity. You have a sharp intellect, girl. You seek the truth, but you fear what you cannot explain. Slytherin could help you achieve greatness in science. Gryffindor would teach you the courage to be wrong. I want to know, she thought firmly. To know. Very well. If knowledge is your goal, then let it be. Ravenclaw. The hat shouted the last word to the entire hall. The table beneath the blue and bronze banners erupted in applause. Cordelia removed the hat, feeling relief wash through her body like warm tea. She walked to her table, where older students greeted her. A few minutes later, Elara joined her, also Ravenclaw, which surprised Cordelia, for Elara seemed so chaotic. Perhaps the hat saw a different kind of mind in her, she decided. The feast was magnificent, but Cordelia barely touched her food. She was too exhilarated. Her thoughts were already up there, in the tower she could now call home. After the feast, the prefects, a tall boy named Julian, and a serious girl named Priya, led the first years away from the hall. They did not descend into the dungeons like the Slytherins, nor go towards the kitchens like the Hufflepuffs. They climbed, up and up. The spiral staircases were dizzying. They passed portraits of scholarly wizards, niches filled with ancient artifacts. With every floor, the air became cleaner and cooler. Finally, they stopped before a door of polished, aged wood. It had no handle and no keyhole, only a bronze knocker in the shape of an eagle. "Attention," said Priya, raising her hand. "The entrance to the Ravenclaw common room differs from the others. We do not use passwords. Passwords can be forgotten, overheard, or stolen. An idea, however, cannot be stolen. To enter, you must answer a question. And if we don't know the answer?" asked one of the boys in a frightened voice. "Then you must wait until someone comes along who does," Julian smiled. "It is a wonderful way to meet older students and learn something new." He knocked with the eagle. The bird sprang to life, turned its head, and spoke in a soft musical voice. "The more you take from it, the larger it becomes. What is it?" The first years froze. Cordelia felt her brain instantly engage. It was a classic riddle. She cycled through variables. Knowledge? No. Knowledge does not grow larger when you take from it. It spreads. Time? No. "A pit," said Elara quietly. The eagle inclined its head. "Reasoning?" it asked, though its tone was benevolent. "When you dig earth out of a pit, you take the earth away, but the pit itself gets bigger," Elara explained, shrugging as if it were obvious. "Impeccable," said the eagle, and the door swung silently open. Cordelia felt a slight pang of envy. She knew that answer, but Elara had been faster. Her thinking was lateral, instantaneous. "I must be more alert," Cordelia admonished herself. But all thoughts vanished when she stepped across the threshold of the common room. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. The room was circular and vast, situated at the very top of the tower. The ceiling was domed, painted with stars that moved exactly as they did in the real sky. High arched windows looked out on all sides, offering a panorama of the mountains, the lake, and the forest. The air here smelled of old parchment, ink, and wind. In the center stood a statue of Rowena Ravenclaw in white marble. She looked down at the students with a slight, barely perceptible smile, as if she knew the answers to all the questions of the universe. There were bookcases everywhere, lining every wall, filling the spaces between windows. Tables, armchairs of soft blue fabric, cozy niches for reading. "Welcome home," said Priya. "Here, reason is valued, but remember, reason comes in many forms. Rest now. Your belongings are already in the dormitories." The first-year girls' dormitory was further up the stairs. The room held 5 four-poster beds hung with sky-blue silk. The windows here were even larger, and through them, one could hear the wind singing its eternal song around the tower. This sound, the whistling of the wind, seemed loud to Cordelia at first, but within a minute she realized it was hypnotic. It was nature's white noise. She unpacked her things. She placed the photograph of her parents. They were not smiling but looked on with pride, and a stack of her favorite notebooks on the bedside table. Archimedes was already asleep in his cage, head tucked under his wing. Cordelia changed into her pajamas and climbed under the quilt. The bedding smelled of lavender and fresh air. She lay there, listening to the wind. At home, in the Blackwood manor, it was always quiet. The silence there was heavy, demanding. Here, the silence was alive. "Good night," whispered Elara from the next bed. "Good night," Cordelia replied. She closed her eyes, visualizing tomorrow. The timetable, the library. She was ready. She was in Ravenclaw. It was perfectly logical. Morning in Ravenclaw Tower began not with the sound of an alarm, but with light. Since the dormitories were situated at the highest point of the castle, the sun appeared here earlier than in any other corner of Hogwarts. The first rays, pale gold and cool, seeped through the heavy blue curtains, painting stripes on the floor in which dust motes danced. Cordelia woke at exactly 6:30. Her internal clock worked flawlessly. For a few minutes she simply lay there, enjoying the quiet. The dormitory was cool. The stone walls of the tower had absorbed the wind's chill during the night, but under the down duvet it was warm and cozy. It was a perfect moment of equilibrium, the kind the Blackwoods valued so highly. She rose, trying not to make a noise so as not to wake her roommates. Elara was sleeping with an arm dangling off the bed, her sketchbook lying on the floor, open to a page with a sketch of a sleeping cat, though there was no cat in the room. Cordelia gently picked up the book and placed it on the bedside table. Order had to be maintained. Washing in the bathroom, where the mirrors were framed in bronze shaped like intertwined branches, Cordelia recited Monday's timetable in her head. History of magic. Charms. Transfiguration. A perfect start. She dressed in her uniform, white shirt, tie in blue and silver stripes, grey skirt, robes with the raven emblem. She ran her hand over the crest, feeling the relief of the embroidery. It was real. Breakfast in the great hall was like a well-tuned orchestra. The sound of forks on plates, the rustle of morning newspapers, the low hum of conversation, the flutter of owl wings beneath the ceiling. The ceiling today was milky white, promising a calm day without rain. Cordelia chose a spot at the edge of the Ravenclaw table, spread a napkin before her, and poured tea. She liked Earl Grey. It helped her focus. "Have you seen the timetable?" asked Padma, a girl with glossy black hair sitting opposite. "We have history of magic with the Gryffindors. I hope they won't be too rowdy." "Professor Binns is said to put even dragons to sleep," Cordelia remarked, spreading jam on her toast. "I think the Gryffindors won't have a chance to make noise. They'll simply fall asleep." And she was right. History of magic took place in a classroom on the ground floor. Professor Binns, the only ghost teacher at Hogwarts, floated in through the blackboard and began a lecture on the founding of the International Confederation of Wizards, in a voice as monotonous as reading a telephone directory. Most students began to nod off within 10 minutes. But Cordelia was delighted. She adored facts. She wrote down every date, every name, every cause and effect. Her quill scratched against the parchment in a precise rhythm, and that sound was music to her ears. She structured the lecture in her notes, using different colored inks for dates and definitions. It was pure, distilled intellect, devoid of emotional coloring. After lunch, mushroom soup and turkey sandwiches, charms awaited them. It was the lesson Cordelia had anticipated most and feared simultaneously. She knew the theory by heart. She had read the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1 back in July. But practice was a variable. Professor Flitwick's classroom was bright and smelled of ozone. The tiny professor stood on a pile of books to see the class. "Magic, my young friends," he squeaked, "is not simply waving a wand. It is intention, multiplied by concentration and expressed through precise movement." The first task was the simplest light charm. Lumos. "Remember the wrist movement. A nice loop and a sharp flick up," commanded Flitwick. Cordelia placed her wand on the desk. "Vinewood, phoenix feather core, 10 inches. For those who seek depth," Ollivander had said. She closed her eyes, visualizing the movement. Loop, up, loop, up. She picked up her wand. Deep breath. Lumos. Nothing happened. She frowned. The angle was correct. The intonation, flawless. She repeated, "Lumos." The tip of the wand flickered barely noticeably and went out. Beside her, Elara, who until this moment had been examining the patterns on the ceiling, simply picked up her wand, waved it casually as if shooing a fly, and muttered, "Let there be light." A bright, warm beam, like a miniature sun, burst from the tip of her wand. "Oh, splendid, Miss Vance!" Flitwick clapped his hands. 5 points to Ravenclaw." Cordelia felt a flush rise to her cheeks. It was illogical. Elara had done everything wrong. Wrong movement. Wrong words. Why had it worked for her? "You're trying too hard," whispered Elara, noticing Cordelia's gaze. "You're trying to order the magic. You have to ask it, or, well, imagine it's already there." "Magic obeys laws, Elara," Cordelia muttered, raising her wand again. "It is a science." "Maybe. But sometimes it's just light." Cordelia paused. She remembered her father's words about control, But here, control wasn't working, so she tried something else. She remembered the morning in the tower, the light that woke her, the feeling of warmth on her skin. She didn't think about the wrist movement. She thought about the result. Lumos. This time the light flared. Clean, cold, bluish like a star. It was stable and steady. "Excellent, Miss Blackwood. Wonderful stability," praised Flitwick. Cordelia extinguished the light, knocked, and exhaled. She had done it. But the lesson was learned. The formula was not everything. The middle of the week brought rain. Fog enveloped Hogwarts, and the view from the tower windows turned into solid grey milk. The Ravenclaw common room became even cozier. The fireplace here didn't burn often. The heating system was provided by magical currents of warm air, but on rainy evenings, some upper-year student would light a blue flame in the great marble hearth. Cordelia discovered the library. It was a place of power. Thousands of shelves reaching to the very ceiling, the smell of old glue, vanilla, a sign of lignin decaying in paper, a chemical fact Cordelia was quite fond of, and dust accumulating over centuries. She found her ideal spot, a table by a distant window, in the magical theory section. From here, she could see the courtyard where rain lashed the cobblestones, but here, inside, reigned absolute, sacred silence. She was doing her transfiguration homework, an essay on differences between animate and inanimate in transformations. It was a difficult topic for the first week, but McGonagall gave no quarter. Cordelia surrounded herself with books. She built her essay as an architect builds a house, a foundation of definitions, walls of arguments, a roof of conclusions. A boy from her house sat down next to her, Arthur. He was quiet, always wore glasses that slid down his nose, and had a habit of chewing his quill. "Did you understand Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration?" he whispered. "I'm stuck on the third exception." "That's about creating food," Cordelia answered automatically, not lifting her eyes from the parchment. "Food cannot be created from nothing. It can be summoned if you know where it is, it can be enlarged, it can be transfigured, but not created. It is the law of conservation of magical energy." "Oh, right, thanks. You explain better than the textbook." This compliment was unexpected. At home, her explanations were called dry. Here they were, useful. She looked at Arthur for the first time and smiled faintly. Any time. The hardest trial of the week was astronomy. The lesson took place at midnight on Wednesday. They had to climb the astronomy tower, where a cold wind roamed. Cordelia wrapped herself in her cloak, adjusting her scarf. Professor Sinistra was a stern woman, but with eyes that resembled dark whirlpools. "The sky is a map we have forgotten how to read," she said, adjusting a large brass telescope. "Muggles look up and see burning gas. We look up and see destiny." Cordelia pressed her eye to the telescope lens. Saturn hung in the blackness, ringed and perfect and cold. She began to fill in her star chart, marking the positions of the planets. It was pure mathematics. Angles, degrees, minutes. No emotions were needed here. Eternal order reigned. But then she looked up from the chart and simply gazed at the sky. Without the telescope, the Milky Way stretched over the castle like spilled silver. It was so beautiful her chest ached. She tried to find a rational explanation for this, aesthetic pleasure from symmetry, but she couldn't. It was simply beautiful. And its simplicity frightened her. On Friday evening, as the first week drew to a close, Cordelia sat in the Ravenclaw common room. Most students had already dispersed to the dormitories, but she didn't want to sleep. She sat in a deep blue armchair, legs tucked under her, writing a letter to her parents. Dear Mother and Father, the first week has been productive. I received an outstanding on my transfiguration essay, and seem to have managed the charms practice reasonably well, though the visualization method requires correction. The castle is vast and somewhat chaotic. The staircases change direction according to an algorithm I have not yet fully calculated. I suspect the variable day of the week or number of students on the step is involved. Ravenclaw is the perfect place. It is quiet. Knowledge is valued here. My owl Archimedes is doing well. I hope you are well. Respectfully, Cordelia. She reread the letter. It was perfect, restrained, informative. But then she looked at the window, where stars twinkled, remembered the warm sunlight from Elara's wand, and added at the very bottom in small handwriting, P.S. The library here is simply incredible. You would like it. She rolled up the parchment and allowed herself to lean back in the armchair. The first week was over. She hadn't made a single mistake. She had found her place in the system. But somewhere deep inside, where logic gave way to intuition, Cordelia felt this was merely the introduction. The real learning hadn't even begun. She yawned, extinguished the candle, and went to the dormitory, listening to the wind singing outside the tower windows, promising new mysteries. The second week at Hogwarts began, not with fanfare nor new discoveries, but with the quiet, steady rustle of routine slowly enveloping the castle. If the first week had resembled the bright flash of a firework, where everything was new, loud, and somewhat overwhelming, the second week was like the slow current of a deep river. It smelled of damp stone, ink, and autumn mornings. For Cordelia Blackwood, Monday began with the sound of rain. In Ravenclaw Tower, rain sounded different than anywhere else in the castle. Here, at a dizzying height, the drops did not merely fall, they danced with the wind. They struck the high arched windows of the dormitory with a rhythmic, soothing patter, as if thousands of tiny fingers were attempting to tap out a code on the glass. Cordelia lay under her warm quilt, listening to this celestial music. She had 15 minutes before she needed to rise. She used this time to mentally organize her day. In her imagination, the timetable appeared as a perfectly drawn chart. Herbology in the morning, green sector. A break for the library, blue sector. Double transfiguration, gold sector. Everything had its place. Everything was under control. When she finally got up, the floor was cool, but the thick piled rugs scattered by the beds retained warmth. In the common room, when she descended, a twilight gloom reigned. The fire in the grate was already burning. Likely one of the older students preparing for NEWTS had woken before dawn. The statue of Rowena Ravenclaw in this dim light seemed almost alive. Shadows in the marble folds of her robes moved, as if she were breathing slowly in time with the castle. The journey to the great hall was long. Descending from Ravenclaw Tower was like coming down from the clouds to the earth. Cordelia counted the steps, 142 on the first flight, discounting the one that vanished on Tuesdays. Her breakfast was invariable: porridge with honey, toast and strong tea. Consistency was the key to efficiency. Greenhouses today, sighed Arthur, adjusting his glasses, which had steamed up from the vapor rising from his cup of cocoa. I heard Professor Longbottom brought in a new batch of bouncing bulbs. They say they are very emotional. Plants do not have emotions, Arthur, Cordelia remarked calmly. They have reactions to stimuli. If you act according to the instructions, no problems will arise. But, as it turned out, the theory and practice of herbology were two different universes. The path to the greenhouses lay across the courtyard, where rain had turned the flagstones into gleaming ribbons. The air down here was thick and smelled of wet leaves and raw earth. It was a sharp contrast to the sterile, rarefied air of the tower. Cordelia wrapped her cloak tighter, trying not to step in puddles. Her shoes were perfectly polished, and she intended to keep them that way. Greenhouse number 1 greeted them with a humid, stifling heat, and a smell that made Cordelia's head spin. It smelled of fertilizer, rotting moss, sweet nectar, and something wild, uncontrolled. The glass of the greenhouse was steamed up from the inside, and light filtered through it in a soft, diffused green glow. Professor Neville Longbottom was waiting for them by the long wooden trestle tables. He was a tall man, with a kind face etched with a network of lines around his eyes, evidence that he smiled often, or squinted in the sun. His robes were work-worn, the color of clay, and stains from plant sap were visible on the sleeves. "Welcome," he said, his voice warm and rough, like tree bark. "We won't be dealing with bouncing bulbs today, Arthur, don't worry. Today we start with the basics. We will be repotting Glimmer Moss." Glimmer Moss looked deceptively simple. They were fluffy purple clumps that pulsed quietly with a faint light. "It is sensitive to touch," the professor explained, picking up a pot. "If you are too rough, it will go out and turn gray. If you are too hesitant, it will try to stick to your fingers. You must find the balance. Confident, but gentle." Cordelia pulled on her dragon-hide gloves. She laid out her tools before her: a silver trowel, shears, a bag of soil. Everything lay parallel to the edge of the table. She approached the task as if it were a surgical operation. She picked up a clump of moss with the trowel. The moss trembled. She tried to move it to a new pot, but her movement was too sharp, too mechanical. The moss instantly dulled, turning from bright purple to the color of dirty asphalt. "Oh no," she whispered, "stress reaction. I need to change my approach." She tried again, slower this time. But the moss sensed her tension. It did not want to settle in the soil as she had planned. Soil spilled, dirtying the table. For Cordelia, this was a minor catastrophe. Chaos was infiltrating her ordered world. Dirt under her fingernails. She felt it even through the gloves. The smell of humus, the illogical behavior of the plant. Beside her, Elara was working quite differently. She had taken off her gloves entirely. "Miss Vance, that could be dangerous," Professor Longbottom remarked, passing by, but there was no sternness in his voice. "It likes the warmth of hands, Professor," Elara replied. Her hands were elbow-deep in soil. She was humming something quietly under her breath, and the moss in her hands was not just glowing, it was shining. She was placing it in the pot, not as a specimen, but as a living creature, tucking it in with earth like a blanket. "You talk to it?" asked Cordelia, looking at her own gray, miserable moss. "Of course," Elara smiled, and there was a smudge of earth on her nose. "It's alive, Cordy. You can't just move it like a book. You have to make a deal with it." Cordelia froze. Make a deal? With a plant? It sounded absurd. But Elara's result was undeniable. Cordelia took a deep breath of the thick, damp greenhouse air. She removed one glove. It was against safety regulations. Item 4, paragraph B. But she had to try. She touched the moss with the pads of her fingers. It was soft and cool. She didn't try to grab it. She simply allowed it to feel her presence. I won't hurt you, she thought, feeling a little foolish. Just move to the new pot. There is more space. It is logical. The moss slowly, very slowly, began to return to its color. Pale lilac. Then purple. It didn't shine like Elara's, but it was alive. Excellent, Miss Blackwood, Longbottom's voice sounded over her ear. You've got it. The earth doesn't like sterility. It likes life. When they left the greenhouses, for the first time, Cordelia didn't run immediately to wash her hands. She examined the black line of soil under her thumbnail and thought that perhaps not all stains needed to be scrubbed away immediately. Some of them were simply traces of contact with the world. Wednesday was the day Cordelia found her true sanctuary, the Hogwarts library. She had been there before, but only to check out books. This time she had 2 hours of free time between charms and dinner, and she decided to explore the place properly. The library was like a labyrinth made of silence and wisdom. Tall stacks formed narrow corridors smelling of old glue, vanilla, and dust that had accumulated for centuries. There was no wind here, as in the tower. Here the air was still, as if frozen in amber. The only sounds were the scratching of Madame Pince's quill, who seemed to be part of the library furniture, and the rustle of pages turning by themselves. Cordelia walked along the rows, running a finger along the spines of the books. History of Magical Failures, Treatise on Dragon Exhalations, Arithmancy, The Language of the Universe. She wasn't looking for just a book. She was looking for a place. She needed a corner where no one would find her, where she could be alone with her thoughts. She found it in the theoretical arithmancy section. It was a dead end between 2 huge cabinets, where an old leather armchair and a small table lit by a floating candle stood. The window here was narrow, like an arrow slit, and through it, only a patch of grey sky was visible. It was perfect. Cordelia sat down, took out her history of magic notes and a quill. She intended to rewrite her notes, adding color coding. After a while, she heard quiet sighs. Someone was in the next aisle. The sighs turned into the sound of something heavy falling, followed by a muffled, "Oh, honestly, why do you all look the same?" Cordelia, hesitating for a second, her solitude had been breached, peeked around the stack. Arthur was sitting on the floor. He was surrounded by a pile of books that looked absolutely identical, thick, blue-bound tomes with no titles. "Trouble with classification?" asked Cordelia. Arthur jumped, nearly knocking over an inkwell. "Oh, hello, Cordelia. I'm trying to find an essay on gargoyles for Professor Binns. But these books, they're enchanted. I pick one up, and it changes its title." "Those are mutable manuals," said Cordelia, stepping closer. "They react to what you want to find, not what you are searching for. If you panic and think about everything at once, they show you blank pages or random texts." She crouched down beside him. Her robes settled on the floor, covering the old floorboards. "You need to structure the query," she continued. "Close your eyes. Imagine a specific gargoyle. Don't think about the essay, think about the object." Arthur closed his eyes. His face was tense. Stone. Sitting on a roof. Water pouring from its mouth. He whispered. One of the books on the floor glowed softly. Gold letters appeared on the cover. Architecture and protective magic. Gargoyles. You're a genius. Arthur grabbed the book, beaming. How do you know that? I read a guide to the library on the first day. Cordelia shrugged. Page 42. Section on enchanted catalogues. They spent the next hour together. Cordelia didn't return to her perfect corner. She stayed sitting on the floor with Arthur, helping him organize his essay plan. She discovered that her love for structure, which often distanced her from people, was a bridge here. She drew diagrams on his parchment, explained connections between dates. You explain like a teacher, Arthur said as they were packing up. Only clearer, without the waffle. Waffle damages parchment, Cordelia replied, and Arthur laughed. She smiled too. It was a strange kind of friendship built on solving a problem together, but for Ravenclaw, it was the most natural phenomenon. Friday evening in Ravenclaw Tower had its own particular rhythm. It was unlike the raucous Gryffindor parties Cordelia had heard about from other first years, nor the cozy gatherings with biscuits in Hufflepuff. In Ravenclaw, Friday evening was the time for philosophical tea. This tradition had existed for centuries. Upper year students brewed a vast copper kettle of herbal blend, mint, sage, dried elderberries, and a pinch of levitating leaves that made the steam rise in whimsical rings. They settled on rugs by the fireplace, where a cold but warming blue flame danced, and commenced their debates. Cordelia entered the common room, clutching a book she had borrowed from the library. She intended to go straight to the dormitory, but the atmosphere in the common room made her pause. It smelled of wax and antiquity. The rain outside the windows had intensified, turning into a proper downpour, and the rumble of thunder somewhere far over the mountains added a dramatic flair to the scene. But inside, it was safe. The tower walls, thick and reliable, cut them off from the elements, leaving only comfort. In the center of the room, by the fireplace, sat Priya, the female prefect. She held a cup in her hands and gazed thoughtfully into the fire. Opposite her, Julian was tossing a silver galleon into the air and catching it with magic. The question is not where objects vanish to during an Evanesco spell, Priya was saying in a calm, measured voice. The question is whether they retain their essence in non-being. Julian caught the coin and smiled. If an object is split into atoms, Priya, its essence ceases to exist as a unified whole. It is simply matter. It returns to the universe. It is the law of entropy. But we can bring them back, objected a fifth year from a shadowy corner. If one knows the restorative formula. So the essence must be stored somewhere? Like an entry in a ledger? Cordelia froze by a pillar. She knew the answer. Miranda Goshawk's textbook stated clearly on page 204. Vanished objects go into non-being, which is to say, into everything. It was a definition. An axiom. But here, in the blue firelight, these students were not looking for definitions. They were looking for meaning. And it was mesmerizing. Cordelia quietly approached and sat on a spare poof next to Elara. Elara was not participating in the argument. She was drawing patterns on the steamed-up window pane with her finger, occasionally wiping them away with her sleeve and starting again. "Want some tea?" she whispered, not looking away from the window. "There's time in it. It calms the thoughts." "My thoughts are calm," Cordelia replied just as quietly. "But I will not refuse tea. Thank you." Elara poured her a cup from the large pot. The porcelain was thin, almost transparent, painted with blue cornflowers. Cordelia cupped it in her hands, feeling the warmth penetrate her fingertips. She took a sip. The tea was perfect, not too sweet, with a slight herbal bitterness. She listened to the debate, which had shifted from transfiguration to the nature of time. "Time is not linear," Julian asserted. "Time turners prove that the past exists parallel to the present. We simply move through it, like a train on tracks." "Or like a river," added Priya. "You cannot step into the same river twice, yet the river is always there." Cordelia wanted to intervene. She wanted to mention Croker's law of temporal paradoxes. She wanted to cite a source. But she remained silent. It was pleasant simply to listen. To be here, among these intelligent people who were not afraid to ask questions that had no answers in a textbook. She looked at Arthur, sitting on the other side of the fire. He was listening too, mouth open, his scroll of essay parchment forgotten. He noticed Cordelia's gaze and shyly raised his cup in a greeting gesture. She nodded back. In that moment, Cordelia felt something new. It was a sense of belonging. At home, when her parents discussed magic, it was like a briefing. Here, it was like music. Every voice wove into the general melody of thought. "And what do you think, first year?" Julian suddenly addressed her. "About vanishing." All eyes turned to her. Cordelia felt her heart give a lurch. She was used to answering correctly, but here, there was no correct answer. She slowly placed her cup on the saucer. The clink of porcelain sounded surprisingly clear in the silence. "I think," she began, choosing her words carefully, "that if we can remember something, it never disappears completely, even if its physical form is destroyed. Memory is also a form of existence." Silence fell. Only the rain drummed against the glass, and a log in the fireplace cracked, sending up a shower of sparks. Priya smiled slowly. "Memory is a form of existence." "Beautifully put, Blackwood. Very Ravenclaw." Julian nodded approvingly. The conversation flowed on, but Cordelia no longer felt like an observer. She was a participant. She had added her brushstroke to the evening's painting. When the clock struck midnight and the prefects called for bed, Cordelia went up to the dormitory with Elara. They climbed the spiral stairs in silence, tired but filled with impressions. The dormitory was cool. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the quiet rustle of rain. Cordelia changed and got into bed. She thought about her dead moss in the greenhouse and the living conversation by the fire. The second week had taught her an important thing. Roots are necessary not only for plants. People need them too. And, it seemed, her roots had begun to sprout right here, amidst old books, blue velvet, and the smell of rain. She took out her diary, a thick notebook bound in leather, and dipped her quill into the inkwell. "Week 2, she wrote in her neat hand. "Conclusion. Knowledge can be found in books. But wisdom is born in dialogue. Sometimes it is worth putting aside the instruction manual and simply listening to the rain. She closed the diary, placed it under her pillow, and closed her eyes. Sleep came instantly, calm and deep, dreamless, with only a sense of warmth and safety. The second week had come to an end. Hogwarts was no longer just a school, it was becoming home. The third week at Hogwarts brought the winds. These were not the gentle summer breezes that rippled the grass in August, nor the damp breaths of rain that had accompanied them the previous week. These were true Scottish gales, mighty, gusty and piercing. They swept down from the mountains, gathered speed across the flat expanse of the Great Lake, and slammed into the castle walls, as if testing them for weakness. In Ravenclaw Tower, the wind was felt particularly keenly. It sang in the chimneys, boomed in the window frames, and made candle flames tremble, even with the casements shut tight. Cordelia liked the sound. It reminded her that they were high above the earth, closer to the sky than anyone else. But this week the altitude she loved so much became the source of her greatest anxiety. On the timetable for Thursday, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it read, "Flying lessons. Joint with Hufflepuff." For most first years, this was cause for delight. Arthur had been drawing diagrams of the Quidditch pitch in the margins of his astronomy notes since Monday. Elara dreamed of seeing the castle from a bird's-eye view so she could draw it from a new perspective. Cordelia, however, felt only a cold knot in her stomach. The problem was not a fear of heights. The problem was the lack of solid ground. "It is illogical," she told Elara on Wednesday evening, sitting on her bed surrounded by textbooks on aerodynamics she had owl-ordered from home. "A broomstick is a slender piece of wood. The center of gravity is offset. The binding of the twigs creates uneven air resistance. How can one entrust one's life to an object that is, essentially, a cleaning implement?" Elara, who was currently weaving a ribbon the color of the sky into her hair, merely laughed. "You're trying to calculate it all again, Cordy. Brooms don't fly because of aerodynamics, they fly because of magic. You just have to feel the flow." "I do not know how to feel flows," Cordelia grumbled, flipping through the pages of Quidditch through the ages. "I know how to plot graphs." Thursday arrived all too quickly. The weather, as if mocking her, was blustery, though the sky remained a clear, piercing blue. The Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff first years gathered on the training grounds near the castle. The grass here was cropped short and smelled fresh, and the earth was springy underfoot. Madam Hooch, the flying instructor, stood in the center of the pitch. She had short gray hair and yellow eyes that resembled a hawk's. She radiated the same energy as the wind around them. Sharp and impatient. "Well, what are you waiting for?" she barked. "Stand by your broom, left hand over the handle, right hand to the side. Clearly and loudly say, 'Up!'" 20 broomsticks lay on the ground. They looked old and worn, with some twigs sticking out at odd angles. Cordelia's broom was dark wood, with a deep scratch near the top. "Up!" shouted Arthur. His broom jumped instantly into his hand. He beamed with happiness. "Up!" commanded Elara. Her broom rose, performed a pirouette in the air, and landed softly in her palm. Cordelia took a deep breath. She steadied her breathing. She looked at the broom, trying to calculate the trajectory. "Up," she said. Her voice was level, but not commanding. The broom did not even twitch. It lay in the grass, ignoring her existence. Up! Cordelia tried again, adding a little more volume. The handle gave a barely perceptible jerk and froze again. Cordelia felt her cheeks beginning to burn. Around her, almost everyone was holding their brooms. The Hufflepuffs were laughing merrily, helping one another. Even the least confident students had managed it. Madam Hooch approached her. "You aren't asking it, Miss Blackwood," she said. And surprisingly, there was no irritation in her voice, only a dry statement of fact. "You are analyzing it. A broomstick does not like to be viewed as an equation. It wants will, not reason. Will." Cordelia closed her eyes. She remembered her father's words about reason controlling everything. But right now, reason was an obstacle. She needed to switch off the analyst and switch on whom? She remembered the wind in the tower, how it beat against the windows. It didn't ask permission. It simply blew. "I want you to rise," she thought, staring at the old wood. "Not because the textbook says so, but because I said so." "Up!" she cried out, pouring all her frustration, all her fear, and all her desire not to be last into that single word. The broom shot up sharply and smacked into her palm with a loud thwack. The wood was warm and rough. Cordelia exhaled. The next part of the lesson was even harder. They had to rise into the air just a few feet, hover, and descend. When Cordelia pushed off from the ground, her heart lurched and dropped somewhere into her boots. The earth fell away. It was the most terrifying sensation of lost control she had ever experienced. She hung in the air, gripping the handle, and she swayed. She tensed instinctively, trying to steady the broom with the strength of her arms. "Relax your shoulders," shouted Madam Hooch. "If you are tense, you will fall. Be lighter." Be lighter. Easy to say. Cordelia was made of books, rules, and expectations. She was heavy. She looked to her left. Elara was hovering nearby, arms spread wide as if catching the wind in an embrace. She wasn't gripping the broom with a death grip. She trusted it. "Just breathe, Cordy," Elara called out. "Imagine you're a feather." Cordelia tried. She stopped thinking about gravity. She looked at the horizon, at the treetops of the forbidden forest swaying in the distance. She loosened her grip slightly. The broom stopped trembling. It stabilized. Cordelia was hanging in the air. She wasn't flying like a bird. She wasn't doing tricks. She simply wasn't falling. And in that moment, 4 feet above the ground, she realized that balance was not static. Balance was constant, microscopic motion. It was the ability to teeter between falling and flying. When she landed, her legs were shaking. She received no praise for natural talent like Elara. But as she returned the broom to its place, she felt a strange satisfaction. She had met chaos face to face and stood her ground. The evening of that day was quiet. The adrenaline from the flying lesson had subsided, leaving behind a pleasant fatigue. Cordelia didn't go to dinner immediately. She wanted to be alone. She wandered the corridors of the 5th floor, where it was usually deserted. The torchlight here was dim, and the shadows long. She walked, immersed in thoughts about the nature of fear, when suddenly she felt the temperature drop sharply. A figure drifted out of the wall ahead. It was a woman, tall and slender, in a floor-length gown of ancient cut. She was pearly white, translucent, and her long hair fell to her waist. It was the Grey Lady, the ghost of Ravenclaw Tower. Cordelia stopped. She had seen the Grey Lady before. She sometimes drifted through the common room, ignoring the students. But they had never spoken. The ghost stopped by a window, gazing at the moon rising over the lake. Her face was unspeakably sad, but beautiful, with that cold beauty inherent in marble statues. Cordelia didn't know if she should speak. Politeness demanded a greeting, but intuition suggested silence was more appropriate. She simply took a step forward and stood nearby, looking out the window. For a few minutes they stood in silence. A living girl and a dead woman. "You fear falling," the Grey Lady said suddenly. Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. She wasn't asking, she was stating. Cordelia started, but didn't turn away. "I fear losing control," she answered honestly. "On a broom, there is no logic, only wind." The Grey Lady slowly turned her head. Her eyes were empty and deep, all at once. "Logic is a shield, child. We wear it to protect ourselves from the world. But a shield has weight. Sometimes it becomes so heavy it prevents you from taking flight." She reached out a transparent hand as if trying to touch the glass, but her fingers passed through it. "My mother, Rowena, valued intellect above all else," she continued, barely audibly. "She built walls of knowledge. But she forgot that a tower needs not only walls, it needs windows. To see that which cannot be explained." Cordelia pondered these words. A shield becoming a burden. "And what should I do?" she asked. "How do I learn to trust the wind?" The Grey Lady smiled faintly. It was a very sad but gentle smile. "Do not try to understand the wind. Simply allow it to be. And allow yourself to be imperfect. A mistake is not a fall. It is a way to find out where your wings are." The ghost began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. "Thank you," whispered Cordelia. "Seek lightness, Cordelia Blackwood," came the fading voice. "Knowledge is heavy, wisdom is weightless." Cordelia was left alone in the corridor. She felt cold, but a strange warmth was spreading inside her. She realized that today on the pitch, she had done exactly that. She had allowed herself to be imperfect. She hadn't flown like a bird. She had just hovered. But that was enough. Friday was a return to Cordelia's comfort zone. After the chaos of the windy sky and the mystical conversation with the ghost, the potions lesson seemed like a quiet island in the middle of a stormy ocean. The Hogwarts dungeons always lived their own life, separate from the rest of the castle. You couldn't hear the howling wind here. The lighting didn't change with the clouds in the sky. An eternal, stable gloom reigned here, saturated with the scents of dried herbs, sulfur, and pickled roots. To some, this place might seem gloomy, but to Cordelia, it was a temple of precision. The classroom was filled with steam rising from dozens of copper cauldrons. Professor Slughorn, who seemed not to have changed at all in recent decades, except perhaps his velvet smoking jacket was an even richer shade of cherry, moved between the rows, nodding approvingly or gently correcting the students' movements. "Today we are brewing a Forgetfulness Potion," he announced, his voice booming, echoing off the stone walls. "Ironic, is it not? To brew a potion that causes forgetfulness, you need a memory as sharp as a razor and attention to detail." Cordelia laid out her ingredients. Sprigs of valerian, mistletoe berries, water from the river Lethe in a small sealed vial, a silver knife. She picked up a sprig of valerian, The instructions required it to be sliced finely, but retaining the juices. Cordelia took the knife. Snip, snip, snip. The rhythmic sound of the blade touching the wooden board calmed her nerves better than any music. It was mathematics in action. Every piece was perfect. Every movement was measured. There was no need to trust the flow here. Here you needed to know the boiling point of water. Here you needed to count the stirs. 2 times clockwise, 1 time anti-clockwise. It was a language she understood perfectly. "You chop like a robot," whispered Elara from the next table. She had already managed to smudge soot on her cheek, and her valerian looked more crushed than sliced. "I chop efficiently," Cordelia replied without raising her head. "Efficiency is the guarantee of a stable reaction." She added the mistletoe berries to the cauldron. The liquid instantly changed color from dirty brown to silvery blue. The steam curled in a spiral. It was beautiful. But it was the beauty of order, not chaos. Professor Slughorn stopped by her cauldron. He leaned in, inhaled the aroma of the potion deeply and squinted with pleasure. "Oh, Miss Blackwood, flawless. Simply flawless. Look at that pearlescent sheen. Your potion has the perfect texture. That is exactly what I call elegance of preparation. 10 points to Ravenclaw." Cordelia allowed herself a barely perceptible smile. She wiped her hands on a clean linen cloth. This was her victory. After the uncertainty of the flying lesson, after the fear of falling, she felt the ground beneath her feet again. She had proved to herself that her method worked too. But as she poured the finished potion into vials, she remembered the Grey Lady's words. "Knowledge is heavy. Wisdom is weightless." Perhaps potions was her heavy knowledge, her foundation. And that was fine. One didn't have to fly all the time. Sometimes it was nice to simply stand firmly on one's feet and do one's job well. The weekend brought a true autumnal chill. The castle began to prepare for October. The first pumpkins appeared in the corridors, small and inconspicuous for now, but hinting at the approach of Halloween. On Saturday, Cordelia didn't go to the library. She felt she needed a little lightness. Instead, she took a warm plaid rug, a flask of tea, and went out into the clock tower courtyard. There, on a wide stone parapet, sat Elara and Arthur. Elara was drawing, of course, and Arthur was trying to teach his pet rat to sit, unsuccessfully. "Oh, Cordy." Elara waved a hand stained with charcoal. "Come join us. The sun is warming like summer here, if you ignore the wind." Cordelia sat down next to them. She hadn't brought textbooks or notebooks. Just herself. She watched the wind chase dry leaves across the courtyard. The leaves rose up, whirled, fell, and took flight again. Chaotic, unpredictable, beautiful. "You know," she said suddenly, taking a sip of tea, "I think next time in flying I might try closing my eyes." Arthur looked at her in horror, adjusting his glasses. "Have you lost your mind? You'll crash." "No," Cordelia replied, and there was a new, calm confidence in her voice. "I won't crash. I will simply stop being afraid of the height. I will let the broom do its work." Elara stopped drawing. She looked at Cordelia intently with her bright eyes, in which the sky was reflected. "You're changing, Blackwood," she said with a smile. "You're becoming less square." "I am not becoming less square," Cordelia retorted, but the corners of her lips twitched upwards. I am simply adding a few curves to the corners, for better aerodynamics." They laughed. The wind caught their laughter and carried it up towards the high spires of the castle. On Sunday evening, concluding the third week, Cordelia sat in her dormitory. She looked at two things lying on her bedside table: a perfectly corked vial of silvery Forgetfulness Potion, and a feather she had found on the Quidditch pitch, slightly ruffled but strong. Two symbols: order and flow, earth and sky. She opened her diary and wrote, Week 3, Conclusion. The world is not divided into black and white, into logical and illogical. It exists in balance. One can love precise instructions and simultaneously enjoy the wind in one's face. One can be an analyst and a dreamer. The main thing is knowing when to use which tool. I am learning to balance. It is harder than any equation, but the result is worth it. She closed the notebook. Outside the tower window, a full moon was already shining, flooding the room with silver. Cordelia felt tired, but it was a good tiredness. She felt older than 3 weeks ago. Not by days, but by a lifetime. She dived under the duvet, inhaling the scent of lavender. The third week was over. The final week of the first month remained. The final chord. And she was ready to play it. The last days of September slipped away like sand through fingers. Quietly, imperceptibly, and inevitably. The fourth week began with the castle donning a mantle of gold. If autumn had previously only hinted delicately at its presence, with cool mornings and stray yellow leaves, it now declared its rights at full volume. In Ravenclaw Tower, rising above this lush decay of nature, the air became crystal clear. From her dormitory windows, Cordelia watched as the forbidden forest turned into a sea of copper, bronze, and gold. Even the black lake seemed to change color, becoming a deep blue, like the ink in her pot. Monday morning began with Cordelia retrieving a warm woolen cardigan from her trunk. It was fresh in the dormitory. She fastened the buttons, feeling the pleasant weight of the clothing, and approached the window. The glass was cold to the touch. Below, in the courtyard, students were hurrying to breakfast, wrapped in long house scarves. This week was to be the summary. The month was drawing to a close. For Cordelia, this meant it was time to balance the books, analyze the data received, and draw conclusions. She liked summaries. They provided a sense of completion. The first trial of the week was Transfiguration. Professor McGonagall had warned them in the very first lesson that by the end of September, everyone must be able to turn a match into a needle. It was a classic task, a rite of passage for first years. The classroom was filled with a focused silence. On the desk before each student lay an ordinary wooden match. Transfiguration is a change of essence, McGonagall reminded them, pacing soundlessly between the rows. You are not merely changing the shape. You are persuading wood to become metal. You are changing warm and soft into cold and sharp. This requires absolute certainty. Cordelia looked at her match. She saw its fibers. She knew its chemical composition: cellulose, lignin, sulfur on the head. She needed to replace this with the crystalline lattice of steel. Previously, she would have tried to do this by force of thought, ordering the atoms to rearrange. But after the flying lessons and the conversation with the Grey Lady, she realized that magic worked a little differently. She needed not only a formula, she needed an image. She closed her eyes for a second. She imagined cold. She imagined the glint of silver. She recalled the sound a needle makes falling onto a table, a thin, ringing clink. She opened her eyes, raised her wand, and made a crisp, elegant movement. Mutatio, she pronounced, and there was no doubt in her voice. The match did not tremble. It did not smoke. In an instant, it simply vanished, and in its place gleamed a perfect silver needle with a tiny, neat eye. It was so sharp it seemed it could prick even a glance. McGonagall stopped at her desk. She picked up the needle, held it up to the light, checking the point with her finger. Then she looked at Cordelia over her spectacles. Flawless, Miss Blackwood. No traces of wood. Perfect form. You have grasped the essence of the change. 20 points to Ravenclaw. Cordelia nodded restrainedly, but warmth spread through her. It wasn't just a grade, it was confirmation that her mind had become more flexible. She had learned to combine knowledge with imagination. Beside her, Elara was still struggling with her match. It had turned silver, but still possessed a sulphur head, and was oddly curved. "It's a designer pin," whispered Elara, noticing Cordelia's gaze. "For very extravagant hats." "You need to imagine the cold, Elara," Cordelia prompted quietly. "Not the shape, but the temperature. Metal is cold." Elara tried again, and this time the match straightened out, becoming a perfectly respectable, if slightly blunt, needle. She winked at Cordelia. "Thank you, Professor Blackwood." Wednesday brought rain, September's parting gift. But this time it was not the dreary rain that induced melancholy. It was a cozy autumn rain, perfect for reading books and drinking hot chocolate. Returning from the library in the evening, Cordelia climbed to the entrance of the Ravenclaw common room. On the spiral staircase, before the door with the bronze eagle knocker, a small group of first years was loitering. Among them was Arthur, a girl named Lisa, and two boys whose names Cordelia had not yet memorized. They looked lost and a little cold. "What has happened?" asked Cordelia, approaching them. "We can't get in," sighed Arthur, adjusting his glasses which had slid down his nose. "The eagle asked something very difficult. We've already gone through all the options, but he says they are wrong." "What is the question?" Cordelia stood beside them, looking up at the bronze bird. The eagle blinked and spoke in its musical voice. "I can fly without wings. I can cry without eyes. When I go, darkness retreats, yet I am not light." "What am I?" Cordelia pondered. Her first thought was, a cloud. Clouds fly, clouds cry rain. But does darkness retreat when clouds go? Yes, the sun comes out. It fitted. She opened her mouth to give the answer, and let everyone into the warmth of the common room. But then she looked at Arthur. He looked dejected. If she simply gave the answer, he would enter, but he would feel foolish. That was not the Ravenclaw way. "Let us think together," she said instead of answering. "Arthur, what do you think about the first part? Fly without wings." "Well, it could be wind," Arthur said uncertainly. "Or time. Or thought." "Good. And the second part?" "Cry without eyes." She turned to Lisa. "Rain," suggested Lisa. "Or dew." "Excellent. Now combine them. Something that flies and brings rain." "A cloud!" cried one of the boys. "Let's check the last part." Cordelia stopped him with a gesture. "When I go, darkness retreats, the cloud goes, the sun comes out. The darkness, the shadow of the cloud, disappears. Is that logical?" Yes, Arthur's eyes lit up. It is definitely a cloud. He turned to the eagle and said confidently, "It is a cloud." "Correct," came the eagle's voice, and the door swung silently open, releasing a stream of warm air and the scent of the fireplace. The first years ran happily inside. Arthur lingered on the threshold and looked at Cordelia. "You knew the answer straight away, didn't you?" he asked. "It doesn't matter," smiled Cordelia. "The important thing is that now you know it." She entered the common room feeling a strange satisfaction. Helping someone find the truth turned out to be more pleasant than simply proclaiming it herself. She remembered how Elara had helped her with the moss, simply by showing a different approach. Now she had done the same for Arthur. The circle was closed. Saturday was dedicated to restoring order. Cordelia spent the morning in her dormitory, tidying up. For her, this was a form of meditation. She arranged her books, cleaned her quill, and changed the water for Archimedes. When order was restored, Cordelia sat at her desk by the window. A clean sheet of parchment lay before her. It was time to write the summary letter home. She dipped her quill into the inkwell. The ink was deep blue. "Dear Mother and Father, September is ending, and I can say with confidence that the adaptation process has been successful. My grades remain at a high level, outstanding in Transfiguration, Potions, and History of Magic. Astronomy is also proceeding well. The star chart is completed without error. But I am writing not only to report on successes. You always taught me that intellect is the ability to find the shortest path to the correct answer. That emotions are noise interfering with the signal. I believed this all my life. However, Hogwarts is a place where the shortest path is not always the best. Sometimes staircases change direction, and one is forced to take the long way round. And it is precisely on this detour that one finds something more important than what one was originally seeking. I have met people who think differently. Elara draws magic rather than calculating it. Arthur sometimes gets lost in facts, but his curiosity is genuine. The Grey Lady, she taught me that knowledge without lightness can become a burden. I still love order. I am still a Blackwood. But I have added new variables to my equation: intuition, friendship, and the right to make mistakes. And, the result is coming out far more interesting. I am not just learning here, I am living here, with love, Cordelia. She sprinkled sand over the letter to dry the ink. The word love at the end looked a little unusual for their restrained correspondence, but it was there, and it was true. On the evening of Sunday, the 30th of September, the Ravenclaw common room was quiet. Most students were preparing for the new school week. The fire burned steadily, filling the room with the scent of juniper. Cordelia sat on the wide windowsill in a niche hidden behind bookcases. The moon had risen, full and bright, turning the lake into a silver coin. Elara sat beside her, resting her head against the glass. "The month is gone," Elara said quietly. "Can you feel it?" "Feel what exactly?" asked Cordelia. "That we've become part of the castle, as if it has accepted us." Cordelia listened. She heard the familiar whisper of the wind, the creak of floorboards, the breathing of sleeping books. Before, these sounds were merely acoustic vibrations. Now, they were the voice of home. "Yes," she replied, "I feel it, It is like finding a book you have been searching for all your life, without even knowing its title. A nice comparison, Elara smiled. Very much your style. Cordelia smiled too. She remembered the fear of the doorknocker. Now she knew. The answer doesn't necessarily have to be in your pocket. It might be with a friend beside you, or it might come with time. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. A girl in Ravenclaw robes, calm eyes, a stray lock of hair on her forehead. September was over. Tomorrow, October, would begin. There would be more rain, more complex essays, new riddles. Perhaps one day she would make a mistake. Perhaps she would even fall off a broom, though she would try very hard not to. But this no longer frightened her, because she had understood the main axiom of Ravenclaw, one not written in textbooks. Reason is not walls that separate you from the world. Reason is wings that allow you to embrace it. Cordelia leaned her shoulder against the window frame, closed her eyes, and allowed herself simply to be, here and now. In the tower that touched the stars, in the house where wisdom was valued, she was home, and it was absolutely, undeniably logical